She signed the papers like she was doing him a favor. The building sat at the edge of a lot on the east side of Hamilton, Ontario, a city that had never quite decided whether it was still a steel town or something else now. The lot had been cleared months earlier by Caldwell Property Group, one of those firms that bought distressed industrial parcels and held them until the timing was right. The structure they hadn't bothered to clear was a 1,000-square-foot body shop with a caved section of ceiling on the north end, plywood over 2 of the 3 windows, and a loading door that hadn't tracked properly in years. The whole thing sat on a corner parcel Caldwell's development plan didn't actually need until the second phase. They just wanted it gone from the books. Nathaniel Osei was 22 years old. He had $200, not in a bank account, in an envelope he kept inside a coffee tin on the shelf above the pull-out couch, where he slept in his cousin Devin's basement in the East End. The $2,200 had taken him 19 months to accumulate through weekend shifts at a tire shop on Barton Street, odd detailing jobs out of Devin's driveway, and 1 winter of shoveling walks for 3 city blocks in either direction. He had not spent any of it on anything except necessity, and even necessity he had negotiated as close to nothing as it could get. What Nathaniel had, the thing nobody had thought to ask him about, was something his grandmother called the gift of hearing what a thing needs. His grandfather, Joseph Osei, had come to Hamilton from Kumasi in 1974 and had spent 30 years refinishing furniture in a workshop behind his house on the mountain. Not assembly line work, not replacement, the kind of restoration that required patience and a close attention to grain and form that most people were not willing to give. Joseph had taught Nathaniel in the same way he had been taught, side by side without much explaining, letting the hands develop their own understanding before the mind assigned words to it. Joseph had been gone 4 years. The workshop was gone too, sold with the house after his grandmother moved to a smaller place in Ancaster. What remained was what Nathaniel carried, the knowledge, the patience, and a set of tools he'd wrapped in canvas and stored under Devin's basement stairs. The practical problem was that knowledge of this kind, in this city, in this market, was not something that came with a paycheck attached. He had applied to 3 restoration firms in the greater Hamilton area over the past year. 2 had not responded. The 3rd had responded quickly enough. A brief email that said they were looking for someone with a certificate from a recognized trades program, which Nathaniel did not have, and which cost more than he currently owned to obtain. So when he got a call on a Wednesday evening from a man named Raymond Ford, who worked at a steel supply yard on the edge of the industrial district, and who had a way of knowing which properties were moving before anyone posted them publicly, Nathaniel listened. "Caldwell's trying to offload a body shop on the east lot," Raymond said. "Corner of Gage and the service road. They're asking nothing for it. $1,200, I heard, maybe less if you push." Nathaniel didn't say anything for a moment. "I know that silence," Raymond said. "Don't. I haven't said anything. You're doing the math in your head. Stop doing the math." But Nathaniel was not doing math. He was thinking about something else. A few weeks earlier, he had run into a man named Carl Breton at a hardware store on King Street East. Carl did contract work for the city and mentioned in passing, the way people mention things they don't fully understand themselves, that the City Planning Committee had been quietly reviewing infrastructure proposals for the corridor running east out of downtown. Carl hadn't said anything specific. He'd said it the way someone mentions rain. Not a warning, just a fact. Nathaniel had filed it away because he listened to things other people dropped. "I want to see it first," he told Raymond. The building was worse than the description. The ceiling on the north end had not so much caved as folded, a long buckle of metal roofing that let light through in 3 separate places. The loading door had come off its upper track and been propped against the frame from the inside. One of the side walls had a separation at the base where water had worked its way under the foundation over what looked like several winters. The plywood on the windows was old and soft and had begun to pull away from the frames. Nathaniel walked the perimeter once. He tried the loading door, worked it off the prop with his shoulder, and went inside. The smell reached him before his eyes adjusted. something between machine oil and wood resin, and closed-up time. The floor was concrete, cracked in places, oil-stained in the specific pattern of a working shop. Along both walls, stacked beneath canvas covers that had gone stiff with age, were large shapes he could not yet identify in the poor light. He stood there for a moment without going to them. He looked at the ceiling damage first, the walls, the electrical panel on the back wall with its cover hanging open. He looked at the load-bearing structure along the south side, which seemed intact. He thought about the corridor Carl had mentioned. He thought about the corner location, the access, the service road. Then he went to the nearest canvas cover and lifted the edge. A dresser. Not just any dresser. The shape beneath the stiff canvas was a 5-drawer chest with bracket feet, and what appeared to be original hand-cut dovetails on the corners, the kind of joinery that had not been produced commercially since before Nathaniel was born. He pulled the cover back fully and crouched down to look at it in the thin light. The finish had gone gray and flaking. One drawer face had a crack running through it that someone had once attempted to repair with wood glue applied without clamping. But the structure underneath was sound. He could see it the way his grandfather had taught him to see it, through the damage to the thing the damage was hiding. He moved to the next cover, a roll-top desk, mid-Victorian by the look of the hardware. Its timbre damaged but present, the main body solid. A tall case clock beside it, no movement but the casing intact. A library table with a leather inset top, the leather gone. The underlying wood frame built like something meant to last 2 centuries. A pier mirror in a carved walnut frame with 2 of the applied decorations missing, but the glass original, with the particular gray-green quality of hand-silvered glass from an earlier era. 12 pieces total, all of them antique, all of them in the specific condition that made serious restorers interested. Damaged enough to have been abandoned, sound enough to be saved. No one from Caldwell Property Group had looked under the covers. Nathaniel sat down on the concrete floor with his back against the library table and looked at the row of covered shapes in the gray afternoon light coming through the gaps in the roof. His grandfather used to say, They see what's broken. We see what's underneath the break." He sat there for a long time. He called Raymond from the parking lot. "I'm buying it." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Your whole envelope, yes. For a building that might be condemned. It's not condemned. It's neglected." "Nathaniel." "I know," Raymond exhaled. "You know I'm going to tell you this was foolish when it goes wrong." "I know." "Okay," Raymond said. "Okay." The meeting was set for the following Friday. Caldwell Property Group sent its regional director. Patricia Vance arrived in a company SUV with a paralegal and a contracts administrator. She was somewhere in her 50s. With the particular manner of someone who had been making decisions in rooms full of other people's money for long enough that the decisions no longer required much feeling. She wore a good coat and city shoes that were not appropriate for the lot, and she looked at the building the way someone looks at a receipt they're not going to keep. When she saw Nathaniel, something in her expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. She took in his age, his jacket, the fact that he had come alone, and made a quiet calculation that seemed to cost her very little. $1,200, she said, skipping hello. "There's a conditional clause. If our development timeline for the adjacent parcels requires access through this corner within 24 months, you'll need to vacate with 60 days' notice." Nathaniel had read the clause already. Raymond had gotten him a draft 2 days before the meeting. The 60-day window was narrow. The language around development timeline was deliberately vague and could be applied in more ways than one. He read the contract anyway, standing at the portable table her contracts administrator had set up, taking his time with each page. "He's going to negotiate," the paralegal murmured. Nathaniel looked up briefly, then back at the contract. He did not negotiate. He asked one clarifying question about the title transfer, whether the personal property inside the building was included in the sale or had been itemized separately. The contracts administrator checked twice and confirmed. The contents of the structure were included as is. No one had documented them. He took out the envelope. He counted the $200 onto the table in the particular way of someone who has counted that specific amount many times. Patricia Vance looked at the money the way people look at things that confirm what they've already decided. "Hope you know a good contractor," she said, gathering the signed documents. "That roof's going to go before spring." She walked back to the SUV. Her team followed. Raymond had been standing near his truck at the edge of the lot, far enough away to make clear he'd wanted no part of the decision. He walked over after the SUV pulled out. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the building. He looked at the empty envelope still in Nathaniel's hand. "That's everything you have?" "Yes, for a building with a collapsed roof and a conditional vacate clause that gives her 24 months to throw you out." "Yes." Raymond shook his head. He did not say anything else. He stood there for another moment, then walked back to his truck and drove away without looking back. Nathaniel stood alone in the lot for a while. The wind off the escarpment came down into the east end the way it always did in November, direct and indifferent. He folded the empty envelope and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he went inside to start. The first 2 weeks were stussing what it cost to begin something with nothing at all. He had no money left and no income from the tire shop. He had quit to have the time. He moved his cot, his camp stove, his 2 boxes of clothes, and his grandfather's tools into the body shop because Devon's basement required a contribution to utilities that he could no longer make. He ate what could be stretched, a 10-pound bag of rice, oats in the morning, eggs when he could manage them. He stopped tracking the cost because tracking it made the number more real than he could afford for it to be. The building had no functioning heat. There was an old electric baseboard unit in the office at the front that drew power but produced very little of it. He learned to work in layers of clothing and to keep moving, because stopping meant the cold had time to settle in. He learned to sleep in his jacket. He cleaned the interior first before touching a single piece of furniture, swept, scrubbed, cleared the debris from the ceiling section that had come down on the north end. He rigged a temporary covering over the worst of the gaps with plastic sheeting and wood battens he'd pulled from the scrap behind the building. The covering would not hold through a real storm. He knew that, but it was what he had. Then he began the inventory. He lifted each cover fully, wiped down every surface, photographed each piece with his phone in the best light he could get, and documented the condition in a notebook his grandfather had given him years before, a thick cloth-covered thing with graph paper inside that Joseph had used for his own workshop notes. In the back pages, Nathaniel wrote down every piece, what it needed, what sequence the work should follow. He wrote slowly and precisely the way his grandfather had written. 12 pieces. More restoration work than any one-person shop could reasonably take on, and he had no materials beyond what he'd brought in his tool bag. He went looking for what he needed the way people go looking when they cannot pay list price for anything. The antique shops along James Street North and Augusta Street were not going to sell him anything useful. They trafficked in finished goods, and the margins required that they know their materials cost. What Nathaniel needed were the salvage places, the estate sale clearers on the outskirts of Dundas, the architectural salvage yard in Stony Creek that had a back room of hardware and small millwork components, the guy in Binbrook who ran a semi-informal furniture parts operation out of his garage and was willing to trade labor for material. He drove Raymond's truck. Raymond had lent it without being asked, dropping it off one morning with a thermos of coffee and no comment about whether the loan was a good idea. The truck was old and ran rich and left a haze of exhaust that trailed him down the highway. It got him where he needed to go. At the salvage yard in Stony Creek, the man behind the counter watched him move through the hardware bins for nearly 15 minutes before asking, with a particular flatness in his voice, whether he needed assistance. Nathaniel said yes and named exactly what he needed. A set of original brass bale pulls in a specific gauge, Victorian period, preferably with the original threaded posts intact. The man said they didn't stock that. Nathaniel had already seen 3 sets in the bin to his left. He pointed to them. The man said those weren't available. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment, then thanked him and drove 40 minutes east to a dealer in Grimsby, who did not ask questions and who had better stock anyway. He learned which shops and which people operated that way. He adjusted his routes accordingly. He drove farther. He spent more time. He did not spend energy being angry about it because anger was not a resource he could afford to use on things that were not the work. Raymond came by at the end of the second week. He brought food, sandwiches, a container of his wife Elaine's rice and peas, a thermos of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. He set it on the workbench and didn't say anything about it. He looked at the cot, the camp's stove, Nathaniel's face, which had thinned. "You can't keep doing this," Raymond said. Nathaniel thanked him for the food. "I mean it. You're going to get sick in here and there's nobody to know. I'm not going to get sick." Raymond picked up a small shoulder plane from the workbench, turned it over in his hands, set it back down. "This is not sensible," he said. "I'm saying that for the record. Noted." Raymond looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his empty thermos and left. He came back 2 days later with more food and said nothing about leaving again. Across the city, in a corner office in a building on King Street West, Patricia Vance was not thinking about the body shop. She was thinking about Caldwell's spring acquisitions list and a rezoning application that had been stalled at the committee level for 3 months. The corner parcel had been folded into a footnote of the larger development picture. The transaction had been filed and forgotten. Her assistant, a young man named Owen Chu, who had been with her for 2 years and rarely offered observations she hadn't asked for, mentioned Nathaniel once during a Tuesday briefing. "The buyer from the Gage Street parcel," Owen said, without looking up from his tablet. "He hasn't filed any transfer notices. He's still in the building." Patricia looked up. "Doing what?" "Not sure. Possibly living in it." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and returned to her screen. The matter did not come up again for several months. The storm came on a Thursday night in January, the kind of winter storm that the Hamilton Weather Services called significant, and that the East End, which sat in a particular relationship to the lake and the escarpment, received more directly than the rest of the city. Nathaniel had been working late on the roll-top desk, which had been the most complex piece so far. The timbre required fabricating individual slats to replace the 6 that were too damaged to restore, and the work was slow and precise and couldn't be rushed. The wind picked up around 9. By 11, the building was making sounds it hadn't made before. The temporary covering on the north ceiling section gave way around midnight. Not all at once. First, the plastic sheeting pulled free at one batten, then another, and then a section of the old metal roofing above it shifted and peeled back, and the snow that had been loading on it for 2 days came in with the wind in a long diagonal collapse. It came down directly over the far end of the workbench, where the tambour slats were laid out in sequence. Nathaniel was already moving. He grabbed the largest canvas covers from the wall and started pulling them over the slats, over the roll-top casing, over the closest pieces of furniture. The snow was not the problem. The wind was, driving the cold in at a temperature that would begin to affect the wood in the joints before morning if he didn't get it covered. Raymond was not there that night. He had been by earlier in the afternoon and had gone home to Elaine. There was no one to help. Nathaniel worked alone in the damaged cold for 4 hours. He went up on the workbench to lash replacement plastic, sheeting to the roof beams with rope and roofing nails, working with fingers that had lost sensation in the tips by the second hour. He used every canvas cover in the building. He used his own sleeping bag, sealed in 2 contractor bags, draped over the most vulnerable piece. The pier mirror with the original glass, the one thing in the collection that could not be saved if it broke. The wind dropped before dawn. By the time the sky started to lighten through the gaps in the roofing, everything was covered and held, and Nathaniel was sitting on the floor against the south wall, soaked, shaking with the specific tremble of cold, held too long in a body that had been running on not enough food. He took out his grandfather's notebook from inside his jacket, where he'd kept it against his chest all night, so the cold wouldn't affect the binding. He opened it to the first page where Joseph Osei had written in his careful, formal hand on the day he'd given it to Nathaniel. "What looks finished is just what stopped too soon." He read it once. He closed the notebook. He got up and went back to work. Several weeks later, the roll-top desk was finished. He had repaired the ceiling properly by then. 3 weekends of work with materials charged to a hardware account Raymond had co-signed, to be repaid when the first piece sold. The timbre moved smoothly and seated cleanly at both ends. He had matched the original finish with a process that had taken 4 attempts and a full week of testing. Working from photographs in a period furniture reference, his grandfather had owned that he'd retrieved from his grandmother's house in Ancaster. The brass hardware had been polished, the drawer slides fitted, the leather finset surface of the pull-out writing shelf replaced with leather sourced from a bookbinding supplier in Toronto. He photographed it carefully in the best afternoon light, moved to the front of the building where the windows faced south. He posted 4 photographs to an online forum for collectors of Canadian and American Victorian furniture. 1 paragraph of description: the piece, its provenance as he understood it, the work performed, the location. He did not know who Elspeth Nakamura was when she replied within 36 hours. She asked 2 questions: whether an in-person inspection was possible and whether he had documentation of the restoration process. He sent her the photographed pages of his grandfather's notebook with dates and annotations. She asked a 3rd question: had he done the timbre fabrication himself? He said yes. She did not reply immediately. She arrived 4 days later in a car driven by someone else. She was perhaps 65, Japanese-Canadian, dressed in plain clothes with a quality of quiet attention that made the space around her feel considered rather than crowded. She moved around the desk slowly. She opened and closed the tambour 3 times. She pulled out the writing shelf, pressed her fingers lightly against the surface, looked at the join between the new leather and the wood. She went to the back of the piece and looked at how he had addressed the frame joints where the original hide glue had failed. "Where did you learn timbre work?" she asked. He told her about his grandfather. She listened with the kind of attention that makes a person feel the whole of what they're saying is being received. "I've purchased a great deal of restored Victorian furniture over the past 30 years, she said. "Most of it has been competently repaired. This is the first piece in some time that I would describe as honestly understood." She wrote him a check for $18,400. He held it for a long time after her car left. Then he put it inside his grandfather's notebook and sat down on the concrete floor and ate the first full meal he had allowed himself in 6 weeks. Raymond brought it, a roti from the shop on Barton Street, still warm. Raymond came by the next morning. He had heard about the sale from Elspeth's driver, who knew someone at the hardware account. The way news moved in this city, through the specific gravity of people who worked with their hands and paid attention. He walked in and stood for a moment, looking at the empty space where the roll-top desk had been. He didn't apologize for what he'd said in those first weeks. Nathaniel hadn't expected him to. "Where do you want me to start?" Raymond asked. Nathaniel handed him a spokeshave. The months that followed moved differently than the months that had come before. Not easier, exactly. Harder in some ways, because the work expanded faster than the infrastructure could hold it. But the quality of the difficulty changed. It was the difficulty of building rather than the difficulty of surviving. Elspeth Nakamura did not simply buy the roll-top desk. She made calls. She had been collecting Canadian and American Victorian furniture for decades, and had a quiet presence in the collector community that was out of proportion to the attention she sought, which was none. She mentioned Nathaniel to 3 people. Those 3 mentioned him to others. In the collector world that Elspeth inhabited, reputation moved slowly and stayed a long time once it arrived. Within 6 weeks, Nathaniel had inquiries about 4 of the remaining pieces. He used the proceeds from the desk carefully, paying almost nothing to himself for the first month, putting the money back into materials, into proper tooling, into getting the electrical brought up to code by a licensed electrician Raymond knew. He fixed the roof for real. He insulated the north wall. He replaced the loading door, which he had been meaning to do since the first week. He installed proper lighting over the workbench area, the kind of directional shop lighting that lets you see color accurately, which mattered when you were matching a finish to a 200-year-old original. He put a sign on the front of the building, OC Workshop, in plain dark letters on a cream background, painted by Raymond one afternoon when the light was good. He hired 2 people. The first was a woman named Fiona Darko, who had studied material conservation at Fleming College and had been freelancing for 3 years doing small textile and paper conservation work without a studio of her own. She came to look at the pier mirror, the one with the original silvered glass, and they talked for 2 hours, and she agreed to come on 2 days a week initially. The second was a young man from the neighborhood named Devon, not his cousin, a different Devon, who had been refinishing floors for 4 years and had hands that knew what wood wanted even if nobody had given him the vocabulary for it yet. Nathaniel paid them both properly. He set up a simple system for tracking hours and issuing records because he had promised himself early that if he was ever in a position to bring people on, they would have paper to show for their work. He also did something he had not discussed with Raymond or anyone else. He went to see Carl Breton. He brought nothing except honesty. He told Carl plainly that the mention he had made at the hardware store about the planning corridor had mattered to him, that it had affected a decision, and that the decision had changed his circumstances significantly. He said he was not asking for anything and was not putting Carl in any position. He simply believed that when someone's attention changes the direction of your life, they should know it. Carl seemed unsettled by this. People were not usually that direct about the weight of casual information. Nathaniel shook his hand and left. Then, quietly, over the next 3 months, he began making inquiries about the adjacent properties. There were 2 parcels immediately beside the building that had been vacant for years. One owned by an estate that had been in probate so long the executor had stopped expecting offers. One owned by a numbered company that Raymond knew how to trace. There was a 3rd parcel, the corner one across the service road, that was held by an older man in Stony Creek who was not actively trying to sell, but who was also not actively opposed to it. Nathaniel made offers, below what the parcels would eventually be worth, above what the owners had been expecting to receive. He was honest in the conversations. He told each owner he was building a workshop business in the area and needed room to grow. He did not tell them about the corridor. He had not received a document. He had not been given anything he could act on improperly. He had simply listened to a man mention rain and decided to carry an umbrella. By the time Caldwell Property Group's development timeline reached the corner parcel, Nathaniel owned most of the surrounding block. There was a man named Dale Coburn. Coburn ran a brokerage business in the antique and vintage furniture market, connecting collectors to pieces and taking a fee from both sides. He had been doing this in the southern Ontario market for 20 years and had built a business on the assumption that no independent workshop in Hamilton or anywhere nearby would seriously compete with him on pieces of genuine historical significance. The roll-top desk sale had been a minor irritation. The pier mirror, which Elspeth had arranged to go to a private collector in Montreal for a number that Coburn heard about from 2 different sources, was a problem. He arrived at the workshop without calling ahead, in a coat that was not appropriate for a working shop, and with the ease of a man who had not been turned away from rooms he wanted to enter in a very long time. He walked through slowly, looking at the pieces in progress, at Raymond and Fiona and the younger Devon working with their heads down. He stopped at the tall case clock, which was near completion. He looked at it carefully. Then he turned to Nathaniel. "Quite something," he said, not unkindly, "for a first operation." Nathaniel wiped his hands and waited. "I'd like to make a proposal," Coburn said. "The remaining pieces, all of them, I'll take them through my network. You get a clean settlement, no auction fees, no finder costs, no risk on unsold inventory. I handle the buyers, you get a check. Simple." He named a number. It was roughly 45% below the conservative floor Elspeth had told Nathaniel to expect for the collection as a whole. "No," Nathaniel said. Coburn smiled in the way of someone who had prepared for the first refusal. "Think it over. I'm not always this available. I have thought it over." Coburn looked around the shop one more time. His eyes moved across the faces of the people working there, across the tools, across Nathaniel. Then he nodded, said something politely final, and left. Within 3 weeks, the first rumor appeared. It moved through the collector community the way these things move, indirectly, attributed to no one specific, easy to repeat. Someone was saying that the pieces coming out of the Gage Street workshop had been overrepresented to buyers, that the provenance was unclear, that a major piece had already been flagged by a conservator for structural work that didn't match what had been documented. None of it was true. Nathaniel knew where it came from. 2 buyers delayed their visits. One sent a request for independent assessment before completing a transaction. Nathaniel welcomed the assessment without hesitation, which confused the buyer, who had expected pushback. Then someone threw a rock through the office window. It happened between 2 and 4 in the morning on a Wednesday. Nathaniel was asleep in the small apartment on the second floor of the building he had finally been able to rent. The body shop had never been zoned in for residential, and he had wanted to correct that as soon as he could afford to. He came downstairs to the sound of wind coming through broken glass. The rock was on the office floor. It was a chunk of concrete, not a rock, the edge of a broken curb or a patio stone. Wrapped around it with an elastic band was a folded piece of paper. Raymond saw it before Nathaniel could move it. He had arrived early for a delivery. He picked up the concrete, unwrapped the paper, read the 5 words written in block capital letters, and went very still in a specific way that Nathaniel recognized. The stillness of someone who had seen a version of this before, in a different context, and knew exactly what was being said underneath the words. "I want to know where this came from," Raymond said. "I know where it came from, then let's go." "No." Raymond looked at him. The notebook was on the corner of the desk. Nathaniel picked it up. "We answer with the library table," he said. "We finish it. We photograph it properly. We get it to the right buyer through the right channel, and we make it impossible for anyone credible to say any of this about us again. That's the answer." Raymond held the piece of concrete in his hand for a long moment. Then he set it on the desk quietly and went to get his tools from the truck. In her office on King Street West, Patricia Vance was handed a printed article by Owen Chu, who had clipped it from an industry publication that ran a regular feature on the Ontario antiques market. The article was about a library table of probable Upper Canadian origin, circa 1855, that had recently sold through private sale to a collector in Ottawa for what the publication called the highest recorded private transaction for a piece of Ontario origin furniture in the past decade. The restorer was named. The workshop was named. The location was Gage Street, Hamilton. Patricia read the article once. She read it again. She set it down on her desk with a careful flatness and did not say anything for a moment. "Owen." "Yes." "Pull everything on that property. The sale, the conditional clause, the development notes, the current parcel assessments." Owen left and returned. By the afternoon, she had a folder. By the evening, she had her lawyers reviewing the original agreement for any provision, any clause, any gap in the language that might give Caldwell ground to revisit the transaction. They found nothing. The contract was sound. The conditional vacate clause had never been triggered, because the development timeline for the adjacent parcels had shifted outward, which rendered the clause inapplicable. There was no mechanism to recover the corner parcel. She sat in her office that night, after the lawyers left with the room, mostly dark, and the article and the folder on the desk in front of her. Someone on her team had taken a photograph of the front of the workshop earlier that day. It was in the folder. A clean cream sign, a repaired facade, the faint outline of a tall case clock visible through the shop window. She did not sleep much that night. The journalist's name was Charlotte Osei. She wrote for a national magazine out of Toronto and had a particular interest in what she called institutional second looks. Stories about things that had been missed by people who should have looked more carefully. She heard about Nathaniel through the furniture collector community. A contact of Elspeth Nakamura's mentioned the workshop at a dinner, and Charlotte had made a note of it and followed up 6 weeks later. She came to Hamilton and spent 3 days at the workshop. She watched the work. She talked to Raymond, to Fiona, to the younger Devon. She sat with Nathaniel for 2 long afternoons and asked the kind of questions that required real answers. She was not asking for color or sentiment. She was interested in the structure of what had happened. The sale, the conditional clause, the discovery of the pieces, the quiet land acquisitions, the way the business had been built. The piece ran 6 weeks later. It was long and careful and appeared in print and online simultaneously, and it was picked up and referenced by several other publications in the following days. The headline read, "What was inside? How a $1,200 body shop became the most talked about restoration workshop in Ontario." It mentioned Caldwell Property Group by name. It mentioned Patricia Vance by name. It did not name Dale Coburn, but the collector community did not require it to understand what had been buried alongside the profile of the workshop. Within a week, the appointment delays reversed. Within 2 weeks, Nathaniel had a waiting list for the first time. The library table had been the centerpiece piece of the collection, but the piece that defined the workshop's reputation beyond Hamilton and beyond Ontario was the tall case clock. He had saved it for last because it was the most demanding, not the restoration of the casing, which was complex but manageable, but the movement. The clock had no movement. Whatever mechanism had originally driven it was gone. Reproducing or sourcing a period-appropriate movement for a case of this quality and era required a level of horological knowledge that Nathaniel had needed to acquire specifically for the project. He had spent 2 months in correspondence with a clockmaker in Edinburgh who had been recommended by Elspeth. He had sourced a movement from a specialist in London, Ontario, who had been in the trade for 40 years, and who had initially been skeptical that anyone in Hamilton was working at this level. The clockmaker came to see it when it was complete. He stood in front of it for a long time. "I've seen this case in reference books," he said. "I didn't know one still existed intact." The clock sold at an Ontario decorative arts auction in Toronto, and it achieved a result that the auction house's specialist, in a careful post-sale statement, called unexpected. Nathaniel stood at the back of the auction room when it crossed the block. Raymond stood beside him. When the gavel came down, neither of them said anything for a moment. In the third row, he saw her. Patricia Vance had come without anyone from her office. She sat in a good coat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the transaction close. When the applause from the room subsided and the auctioneer moved to the next lot, she did not leave immediately. She remained in her seat for a long moment. Then she stood and walked toward the back of the room, and because Nathaniel was standing near the exit, they arrived at the same point at the same time. She stopped. "Mr. Osei," she said. He looked at her. "I sold you that building because I did not consider it worth my time to open the door." She said it plainly, without drama, in the tone of someone who had been working toward a sentence for a long time. "I was wrong about the building. I was wrong about you. I thought you should hear that from me directly." She did not look away as she said it. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then he extended his hand. The handshake was brief. "You looked at the price," he said. "I looked at what was underneath the covers." She nodded once. She turned and walked out through the auction house doors into the street. She did not look back. Raymond had not moved from where he was standing. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the door. He didn't say anything, which was the right thing. 3 weeks after the auction, the city of Hamilton published its formal announcement of the infrastructure improvements to the corridor running east of downtown, including the service road adjacent to Gage Street. The announcement formalized what had been in the Planning Commission's quiet discussions for years. By the end of the month, the parcels Nathaniel had acquired, during the quiet months of the workshop's second year, had been independently assessed at values ranging from 2.5 to 4 times what he had paid for them. The total value of the land, the building, the completed sales, the outstanding contracts on pieces that had not yet transferred, and the operating equity of the workshop together exceeded a number that a financial journalist, calling for a comment, described in the article she eventually published as significant by any reasonable measure. Nathaniel gave her 2 sentences and declined the longer interview and went back to work. The original body shop was still there at the center of the compound. The same 1,100 square feet, repaired and clean, the cream sign on the front, the south-facing windows that gave good afternoon light. Around it, on the parcels he had bought, 2 additional structures had been added. One was a proper conservation studio where Fiona now led the textile and paperwork on a full-time basis. The other was a climate-controlled storage facility for pieces in process and pieces awaiting delivery. Raymond managed the floor. Nobody had announced this. It had simply become true over the course of several months, the way real things become true, through the accumulation of small decisions that add up to a fact. There were 8 people working in the compound now. 5 of them Nathaniel had recruited from the surrounding neighborhood, from the networks of people who had always carried skill, that nobody had thought to pay properly for. He paid them properly. He made sure their hours were documented and their contributions were credited in the client-facing materials that went out with each completed piece, because his grandfather had believed that the names of the people who do the work belong on the work. In the corner of the original building, where the roll-top desk had once stood under a stiff canvas cover, he had set up a teaching bench. He was taking on 2 apprentices at a time now, young people from the East End whom Raymond or Fiona or someone in the network had noticed and brought in. He taught them the way Joseph had taught him, beside them, mostly in silence, letting the hands develop their understanding before the mind tried to name it. He fed them lunch. He gave them a tool at the completion of every significant project, chosen for what the project had required of them. Elspeth Nakamura visited once a month. She had bought nothing further from the collection. The roll top was what she'd wanted, and she had said so plainly. But she stayed connected in the way that some people stay connected when they recognize something they want to see continue. She wrote Nathaniel occasional letters on heavy paper about things she had seen, pieces she thought might interest him, people she thought he should know. Charlotte Obi published a follow-up piece 11 months after the first. This one was shorter and ran under the headline, "The Workshop Becomes a School." Dale Coburn had not been heard from. He had gradually withdrawn from the visible parts of the Southern Ontario collector scene. No announcement, no explanation. Simply a reducing presence at events and an absence from conversations he had once been central to. No one asked Nathaniel about him, and Nathaniel did not raise him. Carl Breton still worked in the planning office. Once a year, on the anniversary of the sale, Nathaniel sent him a card. No money, no particulars explanation. Just a note that said, "Thank you for mentioning the rain." Patricia Vance issued a new internal policy at Caldwell Property Group in the months following the auction. Owen Chu mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to Raymond, who mentioned it to Nathaniel without making much of it. The policy required that any property being divested, regardless of assessed value, receive a physical walkthrough by a member of the acquisitions team before the transaction closed, not a remote assessment. A person standing in the building, looking at what was inside it, filing a written observation. When the board had asked Patricia for the rationale, she had said only that experience had recently reminded her that structures contain contents, and that contents were sometimes the larger part of the story. She had not named Nathaniel. She had not needed to. On a Friday evening in late October, about a year after the sale that had started everything, Nathaniel sat on the low step of the workshop's open loading door and looked out at the compound in the last of the afternoon light. The younger Devon was still inside, working late on a sideboard. Raymond had gone home an hour ago, waving over his shoulder the way he did. Fiona's light was off in the studio. The compound was quiet, in the way working places are quiet after the people have left. Not empty, just resting. Nathaniel had his grandfather's notebook open on his knee. He turned to a blank page near the back, past the restoration logs and the material notes and his own diagrams. He wrote slowly. They gave me a building they had already decided was worthless. They were wrong about the building, but they were most wrong about who would walk into it and what he would see. He read it once. He added one line beneath it. What matters is not the size of what you're given. It is the quality of your attention to it. He closed the notebook. Outside, across the newly widened service road, a light came on in the building that had once been the vacant corner lot. It was occupied now, leased to a metalworking studio that had come in 6 months ago. part of the slow filling in of the corridor that the city's infrastructure investment had begun to draw. Nathaniel watched the light for a moment. Then he stood up, pulled the loading door closed, and walked around the side of the building to the rear entrance, where the stairs led up to his apartment. He had a piece to assess in the morning. A chest of drawers from a property in Dundas, 19th century, condition unknown, which an estate lawyer had described over the phone as probably not worth the trip. The lawyer had seemed almost apologetic about calling. Nathaniel had said he would be there at 9. There are things in this story that belong to Lucas Merritt alone. The specific garage, the specific city, the specific cars under the specific tarps. But there is something underneath the story that belongs to everyone who has ever been handed, something that someone else had stopped believing in. We learn early, most of us, to take the assessments other people make of us seriously. We learn to respect their experience, their position, their obvious success. We learn that when someone with a good coat and a company car looks at a thing and says it isn't worth much, they probably know something we don't. Sometimes they do. But here is what gets missed. The people who underestimate what is in front of them are not usually smarter or more capable than the person they are dismissing. They are faster. They have learned to process what is visible and move on. The price, the surface, the location, the age, the appearance of the person holding the door open. They have been rewarded, again and again, for making these assessments quickly. So they keep making them quickly. What that speed costs them is the interior, what's under the canvas, what's at the back of the lot. What a young man with a notebook and a grandfather's tools might see in a building that a regional director decided wasn't worth opening. The gift is not in the garage or the body shop. The gift is in the quality of attention you bring to what other people have already decided to walk past. Pay attention to what gets dismissed. Learn to hear what the dismissal is really saying. Not about the thing being dismissed, but about the speed of the person doing the dismissing. And when someone hands you a key to something they've already decided is worthless, take a very long look at what they didn't bother to look at. That is almost always where the real thing is.